Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's September 16th, 2020, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're discussing great ape conservation in Africa, and how that goes hand in hand with efforts to protect the second largest rainforest in the world. We welcome to the program Ekwoge Abwe, head of the Ebo Forest Research Project in Cameroon. Abwe tells us the story of how he became the first scientist to discover Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzees using tools to crack open nuts. And he discusses ongoing efforts to safeguard Ebo Forest against the threats of oil palm expansion and logging. We also speak with Alex Chepstow-Lusty, an associate researcher at Cambridge University, who's here to tell us about how chimpanzees were among the seed-dispersing species that helped Central Africa's rainforests regenerate after they collapsed some 2,500 years ago, and why that makes chimpanzee conservation especially important to forest conservation today. It's known as a biodiversity hotspot, but there's still a lot we don't know about Ebo Forest in Cameroon. That's true of its inhabitants as well. A small population of gorillas was discovered to be living there as recently as 2002, for instance, but it's still not known if they belong to one of the two subspecies of gorilla known to inhabit Cameroon, or if they represent an entirely distinct third subspecies. It wasn't even until just a few years ago that these gorillas were caught on film for the first time. Ebo Forest's other great ape inhabitants, a population of Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzees believed to number around 700, are the only chimps in the region known to use tools. In this case, stone hammers used for pounding open nuts and sticks used to fish for termites in their mounds. But this behavior was discovered fairly recently as well, by Ekwoge Abwe.
It was actually an amazing observation because only western chimpanzees that are west to the Sassandra River in Côte d'Ivoire crack nuts. And these are distributed in 4 countries, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. So from the east of that river, all across to East Africa, no chimpanzees have been observed to crack nuts. So it was on this day in August 2005 that we're monitoring in the western part of the Ebo Forest. And I heard cracking sounds. They were coming, distinctly from like 3 groups, different directions. And my assistant, the guide from local communities told me, oh, those are chimpanzees cracking nuts. I'm like, how can you be sure about that? And so we moved quietly towards the area, and behold, these were chimpanzees. 3 individuals cracking nuts of Kula edulis in Kula edulis trees. So they actually climbed the trees with hammers, and the hammers were from quartz. That they were cracking and eating the nuts right in the trees. And as they saw us, they fled. And one actually almost dropped, its hammer on my head. And one other thing I noticed was one of the individuals cracking nuts was actually in the tree with his baby. So this could be, like a learning process for the babies as well. Honestly, I didn't know the significance of this discovery at the time because I was actually just starting my biological career. But when I shared this with Dr. Bethan Morgan, she was like, do you know what you saw? And, that's when my whole world started opening up to chimpanzee subsistence tool use. And after that, I went on to discover that chimpanzees in Ebo also fish for termites. They dip for honey, and I later found out they are the only chimpanzees in the world that combine termite fishing and nut cracking. So it's quite an important population of chimpanzees in terms of chimpanzee cultural uniqueness.
In addition to managing the Ebo Forest Research Project, Abwe is a postdoctoral fellow with San Diego Zoo Global, which is who he was working for in 2005 when he discovered the tool-wielding chimps in Ebo Forest.
San Diego Zoo Global has been working in the Ebo landscape since 2002, when researchers from this organization led by Dr. Bethan Morgan discovered what is today known as the Ebo gorillas, which turns out to be this geographically isolated gorilla population. It's at least 250 kilometers from the western lowland gorillas and from the cross river gorillas. These are the 2 subspecies of gorillas in Cameroon, and we think this could actually be a 3rd subspecies of gorillas in Cameroon.
In addition to chimpanzees and gorillas, Ebo Forest is home to drills, another endangered primate species. as well as endangered forest elephants and critically endangered Preuss's red colobus monkeys. All of these forest inhabitants have been facing a number of man-made threats to their survival since Abwe started working in the forest.
The Ebo Forest is actually surrounded by many communities. We've registered about 40 villages around the forest, and these villages depend on food from the forest. They depend on medicine from the forest. For many of the villages, it's like a spiritual, an ancestral home, because in the northeastern part of the forest, there used to be villages up to the 1960s. So these communities, I think, have been living in harmony with the resources of the forest. Where we have the Ebo gorillas today used to be sites of several villages that were evacuated in 1963. And you can see that these communities, used to live just where the gorillas are. And you see this sort of, coexistence between nature and animals. Yes, the people depend on these resources, and that is why we have hunting, going on in the area. But what has exacerbated the hunting and actually made it a problem today is the fact that many people now depend on hunting as a source of income, no longer as a source of protein. You have hunters from many other parts of Cameroon who have settled in the area to supply the bushmeat market in Douala and other urban centers in Cameroon. So yes, hunting and the bushmeat trade are a huge concern and a threat that we recorded from the onset. In addition to this fact, we have now this growing phenomenon of the opening up of large plantations. For instance, in the northwestern part of Ebo, we have an oil palm plantation that has been opened up by Greenfield Plantation Limited, and that is to provide raw materials or palm oil to the Azu factory, which is a food and oil and soap producing factory based in Douala, where I'm talking from. So these are some of the major threats we registered, like in the past few years. Recently, we've had this huge threat of the government trying to transform the Ebo Forest into 2 logging concessions.
Back in July, the Cameroon government decreed that one of those logging concessions in Ebo Forest had been approved. The concession was to encompass more than 68,000 hectares or 169,000 acres of intact rainforest, which is an area about half the size of London. The concession would have cut right through the local chimpanzee population's territory, prompting conservationists to call the logging plans a death sentence for the chimps. But just last month, a few weeks after issuing the decree, the Cameroon government halted the logging plans. Abwe released a joint statement with Victor Yatina, chief of the Ndikbasagog clan and representative of an association of Bannan community members, saying that while they welcomed the suspension of the logging plans in Ebo Forest, they were concerned that the forest's fate still remains unclear.
Victor Yatina, actually the chief of Ndikbasagog, which is one of the Bannan communities that used to have their villages inside of the Ebo Forest. But these communities were evacuated from the forest in 1963 as a result of insecurity around the independence of Cameroon. Just to give a bit of recap about the plans by the government of Cameroon to log or create logging concessions in Ebo. This actually started in February 2020 when the government sent out 2 public notices, declaring its intention to create logging concessions in Ebo. And this was not really made public, though there were public notices. They were not made public till March 9th or so, at the eve of the first consultation meeting at Yabasi. And so, it came as a bit of a shock, that the government could, keep such a decree, which was so important, such a public notice for an important area like Ebo, where there are several stakeholders, including local communities, research groups, universities in Cameroon, all, like a wide range of, stakeholders. So we saw it as a bit of, something was, a bit messy, they wanted to keep something away from the public. And from that moment on, there was this mobilization, against the project. And we wrote, and if I say we, conservationists who have been working in the area, researchers who have been working in the area since 2002, wrote a letter to the government stating the importance of this area and the need to conserve, this wide area of rich biodiversity. So the government did not react to this, but it just pushed on, and the decree creating the forest management units came out on the 20th of July. But then, we didn't sit back. We kept protesting, and I talk about protests here as coming from a wide range of stakeholders. So we kept working, and unprecedentedly, the government actually reversed the decision or suspended the decision, as I'll say, on the 11th of August, which came, just 3 weeks after the decree creating the long-term logging concession in Ebo. And yes, when I say, alongside Chief Yetina, that, it is not yet clear what the fate of the forest remains, is because the decree does not state, what is next for the Ebo Forest. And really want to know, what the government thinks about the forest. And there are so many interest groups here, from grassroots communities to conservationists to researchers, to those with economic interest in the area. All these groups have stakes. And one of the things we proposed to the government at the onset was to have an inclusive and transparent land use planning process to decide the future of Ebo. There are still groups, clamoring to have logging concessions. We still have groups that are thinking of creating oil palm plantations in and around the forest. So these different groups, just make it too difficult, to just sit back and realize that, yes, we've won a victory for the area. I don't think it's a victory. We might have won a battle, but, the fight still continues for us to determine what is best for Ebo. And as I said earlier, the best thing for Ebo is actually to have an inclusive and transparent land use planning process that involves every single stakeholder, especially the grassroots communities. And I think to start this, we should start by participatory mapping exercise for the communities, for them to contribute in terms of what is around their community, what they consider theirs, their farming area, the species of animals and plants that are around them and where they are found. So we have, for instance, the communities that have the Ebo gorillas around them to actually carve out where the gorillas are situated, and if we can have these various, resources mapped by the local communities, as well as input from conservation groups and other, research groups who might be able to have an idea of what is available in the area. And based on that, we can have, concrete steps, on, proposing different land use types for the forest, which could be, the best thing in the long term for the Ebo Forest.
Can you say a bit more about how the logging plans would have threatened Ebo's primates?
Logging is an activity that, as we know, not just cut down trees, but it creates access roads into the forest and remote parts of the forest to be able to extract wood. And so in the course of, creating these roads, you are actually destroying a lot of habitat that is vital for several species. You are cutting down trees that many of these animals depend on for their livelihood. I'll just want to take the example of chimpanzees, for instance. Chimpanzees, as you know, are territorial. They have a defined territory. So each community has a defined territory within the forest, and neighboring communities will actually police their boundaries to prevent their neighbors, from encroaching into their communities. And imagine if logging is taking part in the territory of one community, it leaves the individuals of that community no choice but to move into a neighboring community. And if that happens, you might actually have, fighting or wars between neighboring communities, which can be really lethal, for these groups. So the other thing that I see as a huge problem in terms of logging is that once the forest is opened up, it paves way for many illegal activities. So hunters who could not get so far into the forest, so far to remote parts of the forest. Now with the creation of, access roads, they might go far into the forest to hunt down populations of animals that they could not access before. This is the same too with illegal loggers who follow the logging road, to be able to, get to these remote parts of the forest. So these are all things that, I think in many ways would change the dynamics of the forest once roads are created. And crossing rivers, you have pollution and, all of that. So there are so many things that come into play once you create logging concessions in an area. But that said, logging has happened in many parts of Cameroon and even in the western part of Ebo. And if it's done, in ways that we call them selective and respect the norms of conservation, the species within can actually rebounds from the effect of logging. It takes time, but that could be. But in Cameroon, the laws that govern, forest management units do not actually respect the conservation of species therein. And so we are afraid once the logging starts, it will be like a no man's land, and everybody will have access into the area, and that is what we're really afraid of.
There is an ongoing effort to make Ebo Forest into a national park, but despite its high levels of biodiversity, the forest currently enjoys no protected status whatsoever.
The Ebo Forest is not protected as we speak. Since 2005, it was proposed to the government of Cameroon by WWF and San Diego Zoo Global to create a national park in the area. And this national park request was actually stalled because of protests from grassroots communities, which is the same for the logging concessions today. Why the process was stalled, I said, is because of protests from local communities, and the same local communities are today, against the logging concessions for the same reason that if you transform their forest into a national park, it means they lose their customary rights over that forest, okay? And transforming it into a logging concession means the same thing, losing their customary rights over the forest. So what we advocate for, as I said earlier, now is not just one land use plan for the forest, but maybe several land use types that take into consideration the rich biodiversity of the area. And here we could have specific parts of the forest to conserve, for instance, the gorillas, where you could have, a gorilla sanctuary. That's to the northeastern part of the forest. To the west, you might have an area that conserves the chimpanzees that crack nuts, because that's where the bulk of the nut-cracking chimpanzees are. We can also look at areas in the forest that have these endemic plant species to the forest, because up to now we've discovered 29 new species to science that are endemic to this forest. And, this is a global, resource, and we need to protect this. But we should also note that Ebo falls within what we call the important conservation area, the key biodiversity area of Yabasi. That is the Yabasi key biodiversity area. And Ebo constitutes more than 50% of this key biodiversity area. So it's an area of global significance. So, it's not got any status yet, but I think it has all the attributes, to make it into, an important conservation unit that should be recognized not just by the local communities, but by the government of Cameroon and, the world at large.
As mentioned earlier, the gorilla population in Ebo is very small, and no one has ever determined which subspecies they belong to, or if they're actually an entirely new subspecies. But Abwe says that work is being done. It's just on hold due to the COVID pandemic.
Unfortunately, we think the Ebo gorilla population is quite small, maybe less than 25 individuals. And this is based on the number of nests we found at nesting sites. So we think there's maybe just one or two groups of gorillas in Ebo. And as I said, again, the number about 25 individuals. And the area where these gorillas range is about 40 kilometers square. And all of this we've been able to determine based on the monitoring work we do with the local communities. And so for the presence of gorillas, we use mainly gorilla nest, because gorillas make a nest each night to sleep in, and based on the number of nests, you can tell the size of the group. The local communities are actually aware, where the gorillas are and how many gorillas there might be, probably. We're also using camera traps to be able to see the gorillas, because given that the area is still roamed by hunters, we think habituating gorillas to researchers or humans, could be dangerous for them, because they can't tell the difference between researchers and hunters. So yeah, we're doing quite a lot with the involvement of local communities. In terms of research going on gorilla ecology and gorilla genetics, we actually have a student who is an employee of Ebo Forest Research Project, who is working on his PhD on gorilla ecology and nesting behavior. And what they do is to collect fecal samples for dietary analysis, but also from fresh fecal samples we collect genetic material, which we hope will be used in genetic analysis to finally put an end to the myth about the genetic affinity of the Ebo gorillas. We actually have samples that were supposed to be sent to Spain for analysis, but unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 outbreak, we're asked to hold on to this. So hopefully when the borders will be open and we can send out genetic material, maybe not before long, we'll have an idea of the genetic affinity of the Ebo gorillas.
And what do we know about the conservation status of Ebo's chimpanzees?
So Ebo Forest is one of the strongholds, and when I say strongholds here in terms of populations of the Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzee in Cameroon, you have the Ebo Forest, the Mbamanjerem National Park, and probably the Korop National Park. And in Ebo, we should have between 600 to 700 chimpanzees. And if you are looking at the Nigeria-Cameroon chimpanzee population, which is between 6,000 and say 9,000, then you are talking of quite a good population of Ebo Forest in terms of Nigeria Cameroon chimpanzees. And whether the chimpanzee population is increasing or reducing, we've been doing annual surveys of large mammals in Ebo, which include chimpanzees, gorillas, elephants, and all other large mammal species. And we've seen that over the years, since 2008, when we started this, to 2019, the population of many species, including chimpanzees, has actually been stable. So it's not increased, it's not reduced. But this data is actually still to be written, to be published.
Abwe says that he suspects there's still a lot we don't even know about Ebo Forest.
Over the years, one of the things the Ebo Forest Research Project has invested on is to make the Ebo Forest a showcase for biodiversity research in Cameroon and in the Central African sub-region. And to do this, we facilitate research by different organizations and individuals, including universities in Cameroon, universities abroad, research institutions across the world, to come in Ebo and do their research. And the curious thing is that every single time a group comes out to Ebo, there is something new to science that is added to the world. I take, for instance, since 2005, we've been working with the Kew Gardens in London in conjunction with the National Herbarium in Cameroon to do expeditions of plant identification and plant collection in Ebo. And to date, this group has described 29 species, new species to science from Ebo. And more than 50 of the species in Ebo are actually listed as endangered in the IUCN Red Data Lists. we've also had cases where lecturers and researchers from local universities have made significant discoveries. I don't really want to talk about this because they're actually writing this up now. But so many new things to science have actually been found based on research work in Ebo. You pointed out, the nut cracking behavior, which was discovered just in 2005. So there is still a lot that the forest is hiding, which we still need to know about. And our research has mainly been focused in two parts of the forest, in the west and the northwest, where we had research stations. And I think if it's expanded across to other parts of the forest, we may be able to, show the world a lot what Ebo is about. So I don't think we've actually uncovered much about Ebo today.
Ultimately, Abwe seems hopeful that Ebo Forest will one day be recognized for its importance not only to great ape species like chimps and gorillas, but for humans as well.
Ebo is today in the limelight in Cameroon and across the world for the wrong reasons, I would say. And I think, the story of Ebo should be a happier one where we are all thinking of this great forest that harbors a lot of diversity in terms of plants and animals, but even more so a diversity of the culture of the local people. Because as I told you before, there were communities in Ebo up to the 1960s inside the Ebo Forest. And these communities have their cultures and traditions, tied to the forest. And so the forest is of global significance, in the fact that it falls within what we call the Yabasi biodiversity area. It also sinks 35 million tons of carbon. So it's not an affair of, Cameroon alone. I think it's an affair of, the world at large, because the ecosystem services that this forest provides, is for the world. And I think, having all stakeholders, including donor communities, partners all around the world, putting in a voice and, contributing for the conservation of this great biodiversity will be something we'll be doing, not just for this generation, but for other generations to come.
A species like the chimpanzee relies on healthy forests for its survival. But it turns out that healthy forests also rely on species like the chimpanzee. That's because chimps are important seed dispersers, helping to determine the composition of forests and even to regenerate degraded forests. Alex Chepstow-Lusty says that chimps did just that more than 2,000 years ago, when the tropical forests of the Congo Basin in Africa were devastated by climatic changes. As he wrote in a recent piece for The Conversation, most people tend to think of the Congo rainforest, the second largest tropical forest in the world, as being perhaps millions of years old. But we now know that that's not at all the case.
I mean, there's a long story, obviously, back to this, but it's sort of the outcome is that we look at these accumulation of records from lakes and bogs across Central and West Africa, and in these sediments, pollen is preserved, and we use the pollen to reconstruct the forests and the vegetation that was there in the past. And these are obviously well dated, and one could see we're talking about a massive geographic scale here, that about 2,500 years ago, suddenly the forests collapsed. And what you're seeing then was savanna-type vegetation take over, which is largely grassland with scattered trees. And this was due, in fact, to an extension of the dry season. So the dry season got longer, it could no longer support tropical rainforests.
The conventional wisdom was that humans had caused the collapse of the Congo rainforest 2,500 years ago, but the evidence no longer supports that conclusion.
There's been an ongoing debate for probably 20 years plus, where, to begin with, people were saying 2,500 years ago, that was due to human beings. But as you got more and more and more and more records, it just showed that the scale of it could not be due to human beings, and that the archaeological evidence just was not there to support it. Human beings were there in incredibly low numbers 2,500 years ago. It was after 2,500 years ago that more people started to come in. But even then, they weren't impacting the forests in any major way. And in fact, the forests were growing back because there were obviously fewer people. But everyone always likes to look for human beings as being the culprit for causing human impact, because 2,500 years ago isn't such a long time ago. And in many parts of the world, human beings have been impacting landscapes on a large scale. If I was to take my home example, the British Isles, we destroyed our own forests 5,000 years ago, and this is very well documented. But the difference is here is saying in Africa, the evidence shows that 2,500 years ago, it wasn't human beings do this. It was, due to climate change. And so it's, it is interesting to look at all these different examples. And, one has to look at the scale of these events sometimes to show that, human beings might exploit some of these events, such as 2,500 years ago. And 2,500 years ago corresponds in Africa with a movement of people through what were the rainforests. It's called the Bantu migration, which allowed people to get to East Africa or to Southern Africa. But those people were not impacting the rainforest, but at the same time, they would use the resources such as the groves of oil palm, which would be regenerating spontaneously because the chimpanzees were transplanting these seeds, and they'd be growing up all over the place in the spaces where the rainforest had been. So there's a lot of things to be taken into account in this story.
One aspect of the story Chepstow-Lusty emphasizes in particular is that chimpanzees played an important role in establishing the composition of the Congo rainforest we know today.
So over the period of about 500 years, gradually these tropical rainforests would grow back, but it would not have been possible without all these natural processes, but particularly seed dispersers such as chimpanzees dispersing the fruits of many of these trees. Because not so many people realize, but nearly all the tropical trees in these rainforests, they are dispersed by animals. So as I said, chimpanzees, but it includes hornbills, elephants, bats. But as I said, chimpanzees are one of the main ones.
As it happens, chimps were there at the beginning of Chepstow-Lusty's career, before he even started studying pollen records to peer back into natural history.
What really got me thinking about these natural processes was that, in fact, 27 years ago, I was with my wife to be in a forest in Tanzania following a group of chimpanzees which are next to Jane Goodall's famous group that she's been studying, or her team, for 60 years. They're celebrating 60 years. So this was 27 years ago. And as we were trying to follow this group of unhabituated chimps, so there would be things raining down through the trees like fruits and obviously the excrement from chimpanzees. And funnily enough, many of the fruits in the forest we were also eating as well. We're experimenting, trying out the same fruits as the chimpanzees. And at the same time in Gombe, and he's still there, there was a director of research who was suggesting that in fact the chimpanzees influence the composition of the forest by spitting out the seeds or defecating the seeds. And so they were kind of doing a primitive form of gardening. And these kind of natural processes with the seed dispersal influenced me for many years. But whilst we were there, suddenly I got a grant to leave Gombe. We'd been there for 10 months following this group of chimpanzees. And it was then that my research switched to using pollen as a tool for reconstructing environments in the past. In fact, most of my work after that was in the Andes. But I was giving lectures in Cambridge University, and then we moved, in fact, to France, to the University of Montpellier, where there was a French group who had been looking at the history of African forests for many years. And when I was giving lectures in Cambridge, from the few papers I was using, you could see that everyone was pushing the idea that these rainforests collapsed 2,500 years ago due to human impact. And they used the pollen from the oil palm, the same species that is an added ingredient in most of our industrial processed foods or shampoos, and which is destroying large parts of the tropics, particularly in Indonesia, but is also now beginning to be planted on a large scale in Africa. But in Africa, it's a major component of the pioneering forest, and it's also an important part of the rural economy because it provides a very rich source of calories and nutrition for local populations. But similarly, it's also an important food source for chimpanzees throughout the year because it is so rich in calories and fruits all throughout the year. And the chimpanzee is one of the few animals that is able to swallow the large stone and then it will defecate it out.
That's when Chepstow-Lusty says he began to seriously consider the chimpanzee's role in the history of Africa's tropical forests.
This really got me thinking that when these forests collapsed and then you have these pioneering species colonizing, such as the oil palms, the chimpanzees would have been playing a major role in dispersing these oil palms. And then once these oil palms are established, they then provide the protection for other tree seeds to come along, which are much slower growing. And that allows the typical kind of primary rainforest to grow back again. But these processes would not be possible without the chimpanzees. And so we with two of my French colleagues, Pierre Giresse and Jean Mali, we wrote a paper in Global Planetary Change, and which was published earlier this year. And it comes out at a time when we're all suffering in some way or another the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have a comparison between what was happening 2,500 years ago when the rainforest across Africa collapsed and then they regenerated with the help of dispersers like chimpanzees. And now we're looking at the situation nowadays where, in fact, it's not just climate change which is impacting those forests in the past. Obviously, climate change is very much happening, but obviously human pressures on those African forests, such as the bushmeat trade, which is removing many of these dispersers like chimpanzees, means that, in fact, as these forests continue to be fragmented today, that they will not grow back in the same way again unless we protect those dispersers like chimpanzees. And at the same time, as these forests become fragmented, it creates much more exposure between the animals in them, like the chimpanzees and the humans. So, we're saying nowadays that the COVID-19 pandemic is caused by potentially the spread from fruit bats in China. And obviously in the forests in Africa, there are many fruit bats, which are important dispersers. But at the same time, it makes not only the human beings vulnerable to things like originally the AIDS epidemic, when potentially chimpanzees were being eaten, or even Ebola, but primates and all those dispersers are similarly being impacted by the diseases that we can spread to them. And in fact, 3 years after I left Gombe with my wife, we're talking some time ago, this was actually in 1996, 3 years later, half the group of chimpanzees that we'd got to know, this word habituating, we were following, they died of a respiratory outbreak, which was likely transmitted by humans. So these processes of disease transmission work both ways. And so I suppose, the kind of the main message that one is trying to show from this work is that, 2,500 years ago, you had all these natural processes operating which allowed these forests to recover. Nowadays, those natural processes such as seed dispersers, the chimpanzees are very much threatened. And even up to the beginning of the 20th century, the chimpanzees were probably numbered up to about 1 million, whereas nowadays the estimates for them, it's a little bit difficult to estimate numbers of chimpanzees, but they're kind of thought to be about the order of about 300,000. And many of the populations are very scattered, especially the more you get into West Africa. And they're not always located just in typical rainforests. Chimpanzees are very adaptable and they can move out into much more open areas as well. And in Tanzania, they often even will move from rainforests into savanna areas. So they are adaptable, but the fact that they are adaptable means that they have this ability to disperse those seeds into these other areas, which then allows the colonization.
So in other words, threats to chimpanzees and other seed dispersers are also threats to the future of forests. Absolutely,
and that obviously has major implications for another factor in causing climate change, because the African forests the trees are actually generally very slow growing, and they're very good at storing carbon. In fact, they've been found to be the ones in the tropical forest Africa is found to be much better than the ones in Brazil or in Indonesia. So if you cut down those trees and you're releasing a lot of that carbon as well, there's much bigger implications here for the world, just then going beyond looking at the potential of the chimpanzees for dispersing seeds, really. So in all of this, there are many knock-on effects, and we just do not know what those are going to be. I mean, the potential is, okay, the rainforests may recover at some point in the future, so long as the human pressure is reduced. But then you end up with different kinds of rainforests. There will be probably other animals, even kinds of rats or things like that, which will disperse seeds and fruits, but they'll have a completely different composition, and they won't be necessarily as rich in biodiversity. They'll be kind of hollow structures, really, compared to what was there before. And one has to find ways and means of protecting these forests, and that is obviously very difficult across the whole scope of tropical Africa and all the different countries involved and different levels of development and different organizations working within those countries and different pressures, on local pressures, but also international pressures for example, once again, having large plantations of oil palm, because oil palm is it produces this oil which is just so useful in so many different ways in our foods or our cosmetics, toothpaste or whatever. And we need to find substitutes. And at the same time, there are pressures for, intensive agriculture. It's not just kind of local little agriculture. Countries outside are kind of buying up tracts of land in Africa. And then you kind of, you look at other aspects of what's going on in, say the Congo is the illegal mining of rare earth metals like coltan for providing elements for computers and mobile phones. There are so many different things going on that have to be addressed, and that is the ultimate question: how one goes about doing this.
If you enjoyed the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please consider becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a non-profit news outlet, and just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. Supporters at the $10 a month level also get access to our members-only insider content. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay Newscast. That's patreon.com/mangabay. And don't forget you can subscribe to the Manga Bay Newscast on the Google Podcasts app, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also download our new app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Manga Bay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @MangaBay on both of those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Recchi, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.